Morning. I'd like to call the Kankakee County Full Board meeting for March 13th to order. Today's invocation is from Sam Payton.
Oh, gracious Father, we thank you for another opportunity to ask your blessing by our county board and our county board members this morning. And throughout discussion and decision, we may help to solve problems in our county perspective. We pray that our believers and that our minds and hearts be open to the voices of our community. Father, we ask these blessings in your precious name.
Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The worst possible spot. Yeah, we gotta get him. It's a trip hazard. OSHA. All right, can I get a roll call, please?
Mr. Tripp.
Present.
Mr. Washington.
Present.
Mr. LaJess. Mr. Stauffenberg.
Present.
Mr. Vickery.
Present.
Mr. Olthoff. Mr. Hess.
Present.
Mr. Tholen.
Present.
Mrs. Polk. Mr. McConnell.
Present.
Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Scott.
Present.
Mr. Snipes.
Present.
Mr. Byrne.
Present.
Mr. Seroy.
Present.
Mr. Lear.
Present.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Present.
Mrs. Weber. Mr. Reinfeld. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton.
Present.
Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Ritter.
Present.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Present.
Mr. Fairfield.
Present.
Mr. Wheeler.
Present.
Forms.
We have a quorum. Under public commentary, I have a few. The first one is Sophia, is it Menegaz? Menigo? All right, thank you. I've always wondered. Seen the name. Right there in the back. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sophia Monigo, and I live on Spruce Lane off of Highland Road. And I'm here to talk to you because they're planning to put a solar panel farm up on Highland Road, just about across the street from the park over there. And in going through our due diligence, researching, finding out, we came across the informational packet the board was given. And if you just kind of go to page 11 and you read the very bottom paragraph, it states, because of this fact, staff would caution the county board against having any contact with developers, objectors, or landowners, as they may harm the aforementioned entity's right to due process. The county board must examine each case individually and render their decision based on the facts of the case as presented at the public hearings, and not on public or political opinion, conjectured, outside research, feelings, or pressure from other sources. The inclusion of any outside information into the decision-making process is prohibited and must be avoided at all times. So I'm just gonna ask, what's the point of having a public hearing on it? Why is it okay for me to come talk to you if my opinion doesn't matter? You, as the county board, I know, are very involved in our community, and you represent our community and the well-being of it. And for me, as a 20-year-old, I'm told by all of the older members of my community to participate, go vote, go volunteer, do these things. Well, I don't want to go do those things when I'm finding out, well, if my whole neighborhood, 2 neighborhoods, 3 neighborhoods are upset about something, I can't come tell you about it. I can't call the county board member like it tells me. I can't do that, and that seems appalling. Other than that, we don't really want the solar farm out there. I know you're not allowed to hear it, but we don't want it there. I've lived there my whole life. There's a park across the way I sit at almost every day during the summer. It's not a pretty thing. I understand a lot of stuff goes into it. I've researched a lot. But I just hope that you understand that there are a lot of people who are upset about this one specific solar panel farm that's going in across the street from us. I know there's lots of others proposed, and there's lots of others. We're like, that's a great location across from Ozanga's out in Piatone or Moments or Mantino. Those are great places for those. Across the street from families is not. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Wendy Manigo.
My name's Wendy Moneygo. I live at 5797 Spruce Lane off of Highland Road with Sophia. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I have lived out there since I was 11 years old, with the exception of about 6 years when I was in the military. I came back and I bought my family home, and my husband and I raised 7 children in that house. 2 years ago, the house burned down, and I had an opportunity to move out of the neighborhood or rebuild on that spot. And I chose to rebuild on that spot because I love my neighborhood and I love most of my neighbors. I put a porch on the front of my house, a big, beautiful porch, not the back. The builder was like, what? I said, look at my view. It's gorgeous. I get to sit there and watch the deer run by. This solar panel park garden will be right in line with the deers that run across from Bob Bowen's farm. This farm will be literally, 100 feet from his property. I'm not against solar farms either. Our neighborhood has done a lot of research. There's only a few of us here right now. I don't know if you remember when they tried the zoning board, not you guys, the zoning board approved a special use permit for highway debris to be put out by the park. Our neighborhood rose up in a multitude of people. Now, not very many people know that these solar parks are going by their homes. We've discovered that. So what we plan on doing is not just making this an Aroma Park Highland Road issue. We are pulling up all the permit applications, and we are going to notify all the neighbors in every aspect of the county about what is happening in their neighborhoods. Once again, we're not opposed to solar energy, and I know the county is trying to do what they can to bring in revenue. I get that. I also know that just because the special use permit is approved or you approve the site doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be there. We want Highland Road taken off the table before it gets that far. We want everybody in the county to know what's going to happen. The gentleman from the solar plant farm said, don't worry, it's going to be aesthetically pleasing. Get online and look at the pictures. I don't want to see an 8-foot fence with barbed wire swirled across the top and signs that say no trespassing and danger, Will Robinson. That's not going to be pretty. When my daughter questioned him about it, he said we could landscape it. We could put trees around it. She asked, well, how tall will the trees be? He said, what? She goes, well, you're going to plant trees this tall? Because it's going to take years before they grow up over that 8-foot fence. On top of that, the gentleman from the solar plant company told us it was crappy farmland. Well, if anybody here's a farmer or lives close to farmland, there's no way he's going to get those trees to cover up that fence line. I don't want that thing out there for numerous reasons, and 5 minutes isn't enough. I know it's going to raise my property tax value. Everybody shakes their head no, but the EAV value of the property, because that's going to be industrial and bringing in more revenue, is going to raise my property taxes. I don't think any neighborhood is going to want to hear that. It's going to lower my ability to sell my home. Now, it won't lower my property taxes, but it will lower my ability to sell my home. And when we asked the solar plant man that, he was like, oh, no, the research shows. There's one, you guys, I think, got one research report, which was from a company that was hired by the solar plant company, and it was out in Massachusetts. So that, there's too many things going on here. He said, well, we're not going to use any solutions to clean it. It'll be the rainwater that cleans it off. Well, if you live out by us, in the summertime, in the spring, you got to close all the dang windows because the dust that's coming across that field is unbelievable. So 5 minutes is not enough for me to address everything. In about 3 days, we're going to put up a Facebook page. And we're going to make sure that everybody in this county, like I said, knows about what's going on. I know that there's also a time frame for all these things to be passed, which is why they're sneakily doing it as fast as they can. That doesn't look good for anybody. So I guess I'm just telling you that we on Highland Road and on Vanderkar Road, we don't want this. And we are willing, as you can remember in the past, to put up a fight. We will hire an attorney. Chris Bowen, I don't know if you guys know this, if it made it past the zoning board, but the people out in Bondfield didn't want it. Judge Kendall Wenzelman didn't want it. The farmers out there didn't want it. They forwarded me all their information just the other day. I haven't even had time to look at it all. But I've been told, correct me if I'm wrong, that the solar plant company or whoever, the zoning board, has lost interest in putting it out there. That's how far the people on Highland Road are willing to go. Thank you.
Up next is Kathleen, is it Roybal? Thank you.
I'm Kathleen Roybal with Kankakee Connect. The community group of Connect Kankakee would like to ensure the county board is aware of activities being carried out by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials at the Kankakee County Courthouse. Is the board aware that there is an Immigration and Customs Enforcement or ICE agent working on a regular basis inside the county courthouse with full support of our Sheriff's Department? Is the board aware that this ICE agent has taken U.S. citizens and county residents into custody, fingerprinted them, and demanded they prove citizenship prior to being released? Is the board aware that these activities go stated and published policies for Homeland Security may put the county at risk for civil rights laws? Is the board aware that county participation with ICE may put the county at risk for class action lawsuits related to the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution as it relates to unlawful search and seizure? Is the board aware that many members of our community are now afraid to access the courthouse and that this makes them vulnerable to crime and exploitation without legal recourse? To prevent the threat of litigation that would further challenge county government finances, and with many of our friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers now afraid to seek legal resolution at the courthouse, Connect Kankakee asks that the county board halt the practice of all ICE surveillance, detentions, and arrests in or around our courthouse. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Kankakee County Auditor Jake Lee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just so moved to hear members of our community coming and speaking their issues and holding their elected officials accountable. As you well know, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB for short, states that accountability is the cornerstone of all financial reporting in government. And accountability is rooted in the idea that citizens have the right to know, and it may cause public debate among the citizens and their public officials. So I really do appreciate them coming. I rose today to talk a little bit about some things that we had experienced recently, and part of it comes from my time in Peoria County last night. And I thought it was very important that we talk a little bit about the internal audit functions of the auditor's office and some of the things that we have done to help enhance our county and make it stronger. We posted some of our accomplishments last year, which only gives a slight indication of some of the things that we were able to do together with many of our elected officials. And we really are grateful for those departments who have been welcoming and who have helped us achieve those duties. One of the notions that are out there is the fact that the auditor's office is not an internal auditor. So I would like to dispel that notion. And if you look to the private sector, internal auditors report to an audit committee outside of the executives. In county government, the county board is both the legislative and the executive branch of government. So the internal auditor must operate outside of the executives, meaning we report to the highest entity in the county, which is the citizens, much like you've seen present here today. And so it is very important that we continue to be independent and to run with the charge of accountability and transparency. That is very, very valuable to our office. On that note, there were many questions about the most recent issue involving interfund borrowing, which has been a hot topic apparently. And I just wanted to point out, I did present some of my positions at the Finance Committee meeting, and I would encourage all of our board members to look at what those positions were. I don't want to take up too much time beating that well, I shouldn't say that. I don't want to take up too much time with that issue, but nonetheless, I just want people to know that the auditor's office, we are going to scrutinize every aspect of county operations, county spending, because that is our charge by state statute. And I know there's a lot of issues with the state statutes that we have differing positions on. I've produced the state statutes for Attorney General's opinions and other positions that are supported about the auditor's office. And we intend to continue to raise the level of accountability. We have raised the accomplishments. We have raised the competency of the auditor's office, and we will continue to do so because it is paramount for the citizens to be represented, for the county board to work with us, for us to work with the county board, and for us to work with all of our elected officials throughout the county. I really do appreciate the time today, and just know that your auditor is standing with you. And I do appreciate our citizens coming and voicing their concerns about county government. Thank you very much.
All right, moving on. The minutes of the last meeting, February 13th, 2018. I need a motion to approve the minutes. Mr. Burns, second. Mr. Washington, all those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. Claims Committee reports.
Mr. Chairman and members of the County Board, your Committee on County Claims would beg leave to report they have examined the following claims presented and recommend payment. The clerk is hereby authorized and directed to issue orders to the several claimants payable out of the funds as follows. Highway Fund, $380,203.04. All other funds, $34,700.20, for a total for the month of January 2018 of $414,903.24. For the General Fund, $722,116.34. All other funds, $3,516,839.46, for a total for the month of January 2018 of $4,238,955.80.
Alrighty, need a motion to approve, please. Mr. Stauffenberg, second. Mr. Siroy, that's a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen. Mr. McConnell.
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Siroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Ritter.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler.
Aye. Motion carries. Department reports. I need a motion to combine and accept the reports. Ms. Parker and Ms. Evans, read those into the record, please,
Yes.
if you could.
The County Collector's Monthly Report for January 2018. Total cash and investments of $4,180,518.52. The County Treasurer's Monthly Report for January 2018. Total cash and bank and investments, $4,180,518.52. The Circuit Clerk Cash Book for the month of December 2017. Total disbursed, $277,583.73. Circuit Clerk Cash Book for the month of January 2018. Total disbursed, $306,489.51. The Coroner's Monthly Report for December 2017. Total calls, 133. Coroner's cases, 20. Autopsies, 9. Toxicology, 9. Outside autopsies, 0. Donations, 0. Indigents, 0. X-rays, 0. Cremation, 65. 5 incomplete. Coroner's Income Summary Report. Total of $9,196.17. Coroner's Report for January 2018. Total calls, 129. Coroner's cases, 16. 7 autopsies, 7 toxicology, 2 outside autopsies, 61 cremations, 6 incomplete. And the Income Summary Report for January 2018, a total of $4,915. The Kankakee County Monthly Building Report for December 2017. Total permits of 35 and fees of $19,076.50. Total extra fees of $1,150 for a total of $20,226.50. The Monthly Building Report for January 2018. Total permits 13, fees of $2,710. Total extra fees of $4,556 for a total of $7,266. The Monthly Resolution Report, total to the county, $42,273.58.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Those opposed? Motion carries. Under committee presentations and resolutions, is there anything that needs to be removed from the consent agenda? Does anybody have anything? Second time, anything to be removed? Alrighty then, I guess I need a motion to combine and accept the consent agenda. Mr. Seroy, second from Mr. Kinzinger. Could I get those read into the record, please?
Certainly. A resolution setting the number of Assistant State's Attorneys, the appointment of Gregory Outson to the Kankakee County Board of Examiners and Appeals, declaration of Planning Department equipment as surplus property, Kankakee County zoning map amendments 2018, appointment of Bill Bakowitz to the Kankakee County Board of Examiners and Appeals, reappointment of Bill Warburton to the Kankakee County Board of Examiners and Appeals, the appointment of J. Bruce Clark to the Kankakee County Public Building Commission, the appointment of Nina Epstein to the Kankakee County Public Building Commission, the appointment of Randy O. Langloy as a member of the Kankakee Valley Airport Authority, the reappointment of Peter Vial to the Kankakee County Farmland Assessment Review Committee, the reappointment of Michael Bourgeois to the Kankakee County Farmland Assessment Review, certification of the Kankakee County Historic Preservation Ordinance for Illinois Property Tax Assessment Freeze Program.
Alrighty. Just a question for the committee. Is it Bourgeois or Bourgeois? Bourgeois. I win. You owe me $1.
My apologies, Mr. Bourgeois.
We have a motion and a second. That's a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell.
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Ritter.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler.
Aye. Motion carries. Moving on to highways and buildings. We have number 46, a concurring resolution. If we could read the title of that into the record, please. And we should probably. Hmm. Well, I guess read the bid and then the amount for each one. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. How many pages are we talking about here? it's excessively long, then we don't go through them all. Just a few. Yeah, go ahead and read this just to be sure.
Okay. Whereas on February 15th, 2018, bids were received and opened, and the Committee on Public Highways and Buildings of the Kankakee County Board met to consider the bids for the public highway improvements now coming under the jurisdiction of the Kankakee County Board. Whereas the said committee determined that the following qualified bidders submitted the low bid as listed below for the work herein described and did award the bid subject to the confirmation of the county board. Whereas the said committee recommends that the confirmation of the award of the contracts be awarded as follows. Grasso Construction in the amount of $19,515.75. Grasso Construction in the amount of $88,217. Grasso Construction in the amount of $85,427.25. Hammond Wagner Excavating in the amount of $45,239.82. Grasso Construction in the amount of $74,558.58. Grasso Construction in the amount of $61,843.15. Gray's Material Service in the amount of $45,159.76. And Hammond Wagner Excavating in the amount of $77,886.90.
Can I get a motion to approve? Oh, there's one in the back?
Oh, and Grasso Construction in the amount of $84,352.
Mr. Mercado? Mrs. Peters? It's a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp? Aye. Mr. Washington? Aye. Mr. Stauffenberg? Aye. Mr. Vickery? Aye. Mr. Hess? Aye. Mr. Tholen? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Mulcahy? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Snipes? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Seroy? Aye. Mr. Lear? Aye. Mr. Hildebrand? Aye. Mrs. Weber? Aye. Mrs. Peters? Aye. Mrs. Evans? Mr. Payton?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar? Aye. Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger? Aye. Mr. Fairfield? Aye. Mr. Wheeler?
Aye. Motion carries. Moving on, the resolution authorizing participation in the State of Illinois Federal Surplus Property Program, number 47. I guess if we could have a motion and a second to waive the reading and approve. Mrs. Peters, Ms. Dunbar, excuse me. Close. Almost did it. Is there any discussion on that? Any questions? That's a roll call vote also, please.
Mr. Tripp? Aye. Mr. Washington? Aye. Mr. Stauffenberg? Aye. Mr. Vickery? Aye. Mr. Hess? Aye. Mr. Tholen? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. Mulcahy? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Snipes? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Seroy? Aye. Mr. Lear? Aye. Mr. Hildebrand? Aye. Mrs. Weber? Aye. Mrs. Peters? Aye. Mrs. Evans? Mr. Payton?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar? Aye. Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye. Motion carries. Moving on to 48, resolution for the emergency repair of the timber pilings on a particular bridge. Need a motion and a second to waive the reading and approve. Mr. Vickery, Mr. Mulcahy. If we could just at least read the title in, and then we'll...
Resolution appropriating county joint bridge funds for the emergency repair of structure number 046-3254 on the Kankakee-Livingston County line.
Alrighty, any questions about this? Roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Vickery?
Aye.
Mr. Hess?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. McConnell?
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy?
Aye.
Mr. Scott?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Evans? Mr. Payton?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar? Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye. Motion carries. Under PZA, it just occurred to me as I was reading this, and Mr. Rowe could probably answer this better. Planning manager doesn't have authority to execute into agreement for the county. It has to be signed by the county board chairman. Is that correct?
County board, yeah, chair.
Okay, so we will have to amend the language on the top of this. I think we're okay as long as that's understood. Would anybody like to, I guess I need a motion and to make that amendment to this before we bring it for vote, or should we get a motion to approve and then amend?
Do a motion to amend first.
We'll do a motion to amend, Mr. Washington, and then Mr. Payton. So it should read authority for county board chairman to sign an employment agreement, etc. So, do we have a second for that amendment? We did. All those are in favor of the amendment? Those opposed? Oh, okay, now we can do the reading into the record. Can I get a motion to approve the amended resolution? It's complex, I know. Mr. Vickery, Mr. Byrne, if we could read the new title into the record, please.
Authority for county board chairman to sign employment agreement between Kankakee County and Michael Magruder to do plumbing inspections.
Everybody understand the nature of that? Mrs. Evans?
I guess the third paragraph, I've like reread it like I'm thinking, okay, it's probably something simple, but I'm not understanding are we missing a word in the third paragraph? Michael Magruder will perform inspection and reporting on required on required, is it missing a word there? On required, or it should say as required, or on the required what in the agreement, or it's like there's something missing.
It should be as required.
Okay. So it's not required something, it's just as required. Okay.
Exactly.
Got
Yeah, there's a specific set of things that they have to inspect, but in this case, I believe the word should be as. Would you agree with that, Del? Okay, word should be as, so we'll call that Scrivener's and correct it in the final copy. We good? All right. Any other questions? All right, that's got to be a roll call vote because we are spending money.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy.
Aye.
Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans.
Aye.
Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Ritter.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler.
Aye. Motion carries. All righty, moving on. The next two items are actually under executive. We had a Scrivener's error. These both came out of executive committee. So the first one was the repeal of resolution 1994 000019, interfund loan procedure and authority. So I need a motion to approve and waive the reading of the resolution. That would be Mr. Tripp and Mr. Washington. Second. Now, before we get into any discussion, I just want to make sure that I stress that we're going to limit the discussion to this resolution and what you see in front of you in this repeal. All of the extraneous information will be dealt with in finance, or excuse me, in our executive committee and other things if it gets to that point after this vote. But what you have sitting in front of you is a resolution from 1994 that takes the power out of the hands of the county board to authorize interfund borrowing and puts it in the hands of the county board, the treasurer, and the auditor, which is not what the statutory obligation of the county board is. So the gentlemen who were in committee spoke to that at that point, who were on the board at that point. So I want to limit that discussion to what you have in front of you, the consideration of should the people who are entrusted with this type of function by the Illinois Constitution and by the vote that they put in the county board members, should they be the ones to authorize interfund borrowing on a yearly continual basis, or should you put it into the hands of the people who are not accountable to those individuals in that situation? So about the best I can do as the chairman here is to make you aware of what a no vote to this would mean, okay? Because I'm not sure that there is any recognition of what a no vote to this is. A no vote, if you vote no to this resolution of repealing 1994, because the Kankakee County Auditor has refused to sign the interfund borrowing, as of the end of this meeting, we have no authorization to interfund borrow. Okay? So what that means is that me and the finance director go upstairs and we look through and determine which roughly 60% of the county employees are laid off. Then we determine what 20% of the county employees are furloughed while those layoffs are running out because of contracted notices that have to be given to different labor unions. You vote no to this, we in roughly 35 to 40 days, we don't have money for health insurance for any employee in the county. You vote no to this, election judges don't get paid, probably. Okay? I want to let you know what the ramifications of a no vote means and what the ramifications of the county auditor not signing that document mean to this county. Do you want to have that authority in an individual who is not going to, whether it's the treasurer or the auditor, not be accountable for those actions? So at this point, floor is open to discussion. It's your call. But a no vote means you said yes to all those things. Ms. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr.
Sorry, I
Chairman.
hit the wrong button.
If I could address your question to Mr. Rowe regarding how this brings us in line with state statute.
So state statute says that if a county seeks to interfund borrow, state statute says that if a county seeks to interfund borrow, it just merely requires a majority vote of the board.
Okay.
If they seek to interfund transfer, it requires a 2/3 majority of the
So
board.
permanently transfer.
Yes.
Okay.
This is related to borrowing.
Okay.
The county ordinance, which is currently in existence, is stricter than state statute. So back in 1994, the board decided to pass an ordinance that would put some additional sets of eyes when you're looking to transfer or borrow those funds. So before it is brought to the board, or in addition to the board's approval, whether it's majority or 2/3, depending on if it's a loan or a transfer, it also requires the signature of the chairman, the treasurer, and the auditor. So you can always go more strict than state statutes, just not less, more lenient. So your options, right, are to leave it as is, where you require those 3 signatures, to repeal it, as this resolution would do, or maybe there's a middle ground. But as long as that, whatever it is, if you're going to do something or leave it in place, it always has to be more strict.
And
Thank you. Mr. Ritter, just a moment, please. 5, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow-up question. So if we repeal this, then we default back to the state statute?
Correct.
Right?
And the other side of that would be, it goes back to the finance committee for the yearly authorization, because we are in a constant state of emergency and we couldn't have finance and full board meetings every week when we pay bills. That's why we have this going, is because we have to continually pull from here to pay from there. And then when those funds are replenished through fees and whatever, we have to pull from there to pay for that. Does that make sense? So it's not like the money's disappearing. We have to pull and move things around on a very continual, quick basis. And every month, there's an update on where that is, because you hear in the treasurer's report, like right now, we just got our TAWs. So it's in the positive. But remember those months where you're here negative $4,383,000, that's our interfund borrowing. That's so every month it's reported on where we're at. So there is a continual update. And it gets much worse before we get taxes in July and then in September. And then when interfund hits, it temporarily bumps that up, but you know how much each payroll is here. So just want to clarify that. Mrs. Peters, just a moment.
I'm seeking clarification. So the reason we need to appeal this is because Mr. Lee is not signing? Is that why we need to repeal it? Why do we need to repeal this?
The first thing is because he refuses to authorize the interfund borrowing. So if you want to give that responsibility to another elected official, then you could vote no to this. If we're being asked to repeal this because it is a bad ordinance, not just on that, in my estimation, and others in the committee that recommended the repeal, but also there's stipulations in there on like paying interest. That is another, that's against the Illinois, it's against the law to pay interest. We haven't done it. Frankly, we didn't know this existed because it wasn't even online in Muni Code. That's why we're back here. Last month's vote is void. It didn't exist, basically. Because this, at the time, we didn't know this existed when I was out of town, and this was approved last month at the full board. The other situation. Now we're being asked to repeal it because if we don't, then we have to abide by this, and it triggers all of the layoffs across the county because we don't have the authorization to interfund borrow. because Mr. Lee refuses to provide that authorization. Does that make sense? I apologize, it's very complicated, but it's really where we're at. Mr. Snipes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me preface my statement by saying I served on the board in 1994 when this was put into place. The reason that we put it into place is because we wanted additional eyes, just not the unilateral authority of the board. I also must remind you that the board made that decision. And they made it based upon the fact that they wanted to have additional eyes to look at before we borrow or take monies from individuals. We wanted kind of to have that little oversight as far as eyes. The county board put it on for that particular reason. Also must remind you, for 24 years, that process has not been challenged or changed until today. I submitted to you that we need to have a conversation with the auditor to find out why. The reason we put an auditor in place is to basically examine or have the extra additional eyes to look at or to make sure that when you're seeing transactions happen, are they happen in accordance to the law, to the ordinance that we have put into place? Because a lot of us are not here until the next month or till a committee. So therefore, that process has worked for 24 years. It's only being interrupted or asked to be interrupted now because a challenge has been presented. As to what the challenge is, probably only the finance committee knows, because it seems they're the ones that's having the problems with this issue. So we need, before we repeal something that we have put into place as a protection, not only to the board, but to the community at large, because we state we want to be transparent. We need to look at it. I would, if the due diligence of the state's attorney, because I'm not an attorney, but I would like him to explain to me what 55 ILC 561003 states before I proceed further.
Well, without having 55 ILCS in front of me, let me look and see. Is it? Do you have a copy of it, or is it referenced in the statute?
Thought I would bring it.
That's thank you. Let's see. So this is where you're talking about making further appropriations after the budget has been passed, and they can be made in case of an emergency with the 2/3 vote. Well, those are transfers. Those are transfers. Here you're looking to do a loan. So that's the difference between the loans and the transfer. So interfund borrowing by state statute requires a majority of the board. Interfund transfers require this 2/3 majority.
Okay, so the way we get around the transfer is to kind of say we are borrowing it and not transferring. So if we're borrowing it, that means there should be some type of contract, because if we're dancing, according to what they stated in it's a dance, then are we a unilateral dance, a solo, or is it a dual? So that means that every department is agreeing to this fund being borrowed from their department, if I'm understanding correctly.
No, well, when you borrow, right, the whole idea is you pay it back, and that is another requirement of the statute. It does need to be put back in before the end of that fiscal year.
Right. But my question was, for me to borrow something means that I have to get the consent of the individual that I'm borrowing from, or does the state statute relax that?
The state statute says that in order for a county to interfund to borrow, it needs a majority of the board's approval.
So it doesn't, the person we're borrowing from, they have no say-so in the matter.
Well, you're basically borrowing from yourself, because you're going from one of your funds to another. So let's say you have, I don't know, one fund has a surplus, right? And then your general fund runs in a deficit. You could be in a position where you would shut down county government and have a bunch of other funds sitting idle that you're not using in that other fund. So the Attorney General has indicated in opinions, and state statute allows you to transfer those funds for a temporary period before the end of the fiscal year into a general fund, let's say, so that county government can continue to operate. But it also requires, in addition to the majority vote of the board, it requires that those funds be repaid or transferred back before the end of the fiscal year.
Okay, so as a result, the money actually belongs to us, whether it's in any department of the county. We can borrow from any department that is idle.
Well, there are some funds, for instance, that cannot be borrowed, and those have not been included in the list of funds that the county is seeking to transfer from, if that makes sense. For instance, federal forfeiture funds cannot be borrowed. Those are federal funds with federal restrictions. So those cannot be borrowed against, but those weren't included this year in that transfer.
Okay, so we can borrow ICE money or anything else that's up under the county.
Well, that ICE money doesn't go into a separate fund, right? That money's going into, I imagine, what, the general fund?
The general fund.
Into the general fund.
Which is our money already.
Yes.
Okay, and then we're borrowing from other funds like the road department and things of that nature.
All the ones that were on that list.
On that particular list.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what I'm saying is, so the protective, I guess the protective eyes that we put in place was for that, so that we would have more than just the county board making that particular decision. That's why I took exception, and I still take exception till we have something else in place other than an individual that's able to do it unilaterally. I need to have another eye. So if you take supposedly the auditor away out of this or whatever, and the other individual say solo the county board, then who is the other eyes that we will that the board will know when these processes are being followed, or in fact when it is over, if we over borrow?
Thank you. There are 56 eyes in this room that this Illinois Constitution says you are the ones who are to watch over the money of the county. And we have outside auditors that every single year go through and look at everything that we do. There was an implication that we are doing things nefarious in some of your comments, Mr. Snipes, that I take exception to. There is nothing illegal about what we're doing whatsoever. Oh yeah, you did. You said we're trying to hide.
No, did I say that?
All right, I'm not going to engage in that. No, you actually said we're trying to have the appearance of. I don't appreciate that.
You interpret.
It's what you said, sir.
What I said was we put in place eyes.
Mr. Rowe, is there any opinion that you have that says we are doing anything illegal with our interfund borrowing?
No, I can't speak for what was done in prior fiscal years, right? But I can say that last year and this year, when we looked at the funds that were to be borrowed from, we checked to make sure that state statute allows the county to interfund to borrow from those funds. And I don't have any concerns in that regard.
So in that term, Mr. Snipes, please, let other people have a shot. Mr. Snipes, the chair does not recognize you. Okay, I have to say that. We're not going to engage in this. I'm not going to engage in this.
Did you give me a time limit? Everybody else has the opportunity to talk. I'm asking a question. The question was, and it still remains or whatever, we put it in place for 24 years or whatever, and you're saying let's take it out. Do we have other eyes to make sure, and I'm not saying that something's going to be done illegally, this was put in place as protected, and you said we got 56 other eyes, but they're not here every day. So as a result, I'm asking what other eyes or what other process are we putting in place to make sure that...
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it possible to adjust this to get like a 2/3 vote of the other ayes that are on this? Say we wanted the chairman and a treasurer, the chairman and the auditor and the treasurer. Can we adjust the language of this or no?
Not at this point.
It would be a later date.
That would be something else that the board would want to bring back.
It could be done, but you can't change this resolution today.
Okay, but we could put another belts and suspenders, for lack of a better term, into place to replace this if we wanted to at any point in time.
Yes.
And that would just take a majority vote of the board.
Correct.
It would have to come through what committee, finance or executive?
Executive.
It'd have to come through executive. Okay.
Correct. And just so I want to make it clear, we authorize this every year. This is not going unauthorized. the board is authorizing all interfund transfers for the year because we can't have meetings every week. Because we are in a constant state of emergency, every dollar we spend is borrowed because we have such a deficit. Now, I will say that we interfund borrowed $500,000 less than we did the year before. We borrowed $1 million less from banks than we did the year before. As Mr. Rowe alluded to, they were interfund borrowing seizure money before we got here, and we shut that down the first year. We had a $700,000 surplus. We have turned this thing in the right direction, and there's some implication, which the auditor is yet to explain, why he thinks that we borrowed more than we did last year. He wrote it on the paper. Everybody sees it. He wrote it on the paper saying his reason for not signing that was because we borrowed more money, which is factually incorrect. Okay? Factually incorrect. And you say, where's the communication? It's there written on the piece of paper why he didn't sign it. Okay? Mr. Washington. Still going around first time.
I was here also in 1994. And I have to say this, that none of us individually or collectively are perfect in their reasoning or their decision making. One of the things that happened in that time period was the board decided, without my consent, to have tax caps, to offer that to the people. Now, what I said then and I say now, and it brought itself to fruition. We are in the position that we are because we can't raise enough taxes in order to pay our bills. I say this because we are individuals and we're fallible just like any other individual. The board made mistakes then, and they could make mistakes again. So there's no problem here that I can see that we should have extra eyes other than the eyes that we have already. Any individual board member is entitled to come in and check in with the finance department with whatever questions they have to be answered. There's no reason to carry this on like it's a major argument, and it's not.
Thank you. And I also like to mention that we post everything online live and it recorded for just that reason. Every board member can watch any meeting they want. Anybody in the public can get any information they want. If people come to the meetings and explain themselves and talk about it, then that'll be heard. So, Mrs. Peters, did you have something?
Yes.
Then Mr.
I
Vickery.
guess the whole reason we want to repeal this is because Jake Lee won't sign it, and I'd like to hear his reasons why he won't sign it. Because if we can work out our differences and he signs it, we don't even have to repeal this.
We're starting to conflate two different issues in that opinion. In my opinion, I think in the opinion of everybody else, this resolution we didn't even know existed a month ago. And once we found it existed, you're making a decision here today whether you want to have other people have influence over the finances of the county as far as what you're elected to do. That's what a primary responsibility of a county board member, or if you want to give that away to somebody else. That's the question here today.
I'm not disagreeing with interfund borrowing. What I'm trying to figure out is why he won't sign this. And if
he has already stated those reasons. He said he wasn't signing it.
Can he speak to that? He's here and he's willing to do
that.
It.
Will be at the finance committee next month. He had a chance to come to last month's finance committee and he sat upstairs and didn't come down and answer those questions. Now we're in the position we're in because he put the gun to the head of the county and pulled the trigger. So if you vote no to this, there are mass layoffs. We didn't do this, okay? This is not our fault. And people keep trying to make it our fault. We're trying to fix it, and we are fixing it. But for some reason, it keeps coming back that this is on us. Okay? This isn't on us. We have done things the right way since I've been here. Mr. Tripp.
I don't see us eliminating his eyes or opinion. I don't see anything of that. Only thing that's in place right now is he has the ability to veto the majority of this board. I think is that right?
That's exactly it, and that's why I think it's so dangerous, why it's
I-
separate. And not just him, the treasurer,
Yeah.
both of them. This isn't about just one individual. This is about both individuals
Right.
have been given constitutional authorities that are supposed to only go to county boards.
We're not eliminating their eyes or opinions or whatever, but, okay.
That's what the committee meetings are for.
Yeah.
Mr. Vickery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just use this one example that happened in a finance committee meeting, I believe 30 days ago or whatever. I asked Steve McCarty what the bank balance was in our general fund account. His answer was $980,000. And I asked him what was the next payroll amount due within a few days. He stated it was 1.1 million. We needed an interfund borrow to make that payroll. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else for the first time?
I'd like to clarify a procedural issue. If anyone on the board wants to hear from the chairman, they can make a motion to suspend the rules and allow him to address the board. So that can be done.
You mean the auditor?
Or the auditor, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Can I make that motion?
Second? Does that require 2/3 vote?
I'd have to check. We'd have to look up Robert's rules.
We have to look up Robert's Rules of Order. I think
Be a
it's,
majority though.
It requires a 2/3 vote.
You don't have a second.
there is a second, Ms. Peters.
Okay.
Roll call vote.
Well, what are we voting?
We're suspending the rules and allowing the auditor to address about a separate issue other than this resolution in front of us, which I don't understand, but hey, there's a motion in a second.
Okay.
Mr. Tripp,
No.
Mr. Washington,
Nay.
Mr. Stauffenberg,
Nay.
Mr. Vickery,
Nay.
Mr. Hess,
Nay.
Mr. Tholen,
Nay.
Mr. McConnell, Mr. Mulcahy,
Aye.
Mr. Scott,
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
We didn't have discussion on it, so I'm still going to say aye, but we should have had discussion, so that people will be informed as to what we're doing, so we're talking about transparency.
Mr. Byrne. Aye. Mr. Seroy.
Nay.
Mr. Lear.
Nay.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Aye.
Mrs. Evans.
Nay.
Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Nay.
Ms. Dunbar.
Aye.
Mr. Ritter.
Nay.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Nay.
Mr. Fairfield.
Nay.
Mr. Wheeler.
Nay. Motion fails. Is there any other comment first time on the motion in front of you to repeal resolution 1994-00019? We have a motion and a second. Anyone else? I'd like to make this a roll call vote, please. To repeal. A yay vote is repeal, nay is to keep the current 1994 resolution in effect.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
94.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell.
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy.
Aye.
Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Nay.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Nay.
Mrs. Evans.
Aye.
Mr. Payton. Ms. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar.
Nay.
Mr. Ritter.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler.
Aye. Motion carries. So we'll be bringing back the interfund borrowing authorization for this following year, next month, or this month to finance, pending approval. It will go to the full board. We will also be, part of that is to wrap up last year's interfund borrowing as far as the total for what happened. There's one thing out of this whole process that is correct, is that we operate between November 30th and whenever we approve this in February usually, without specific authorization. So next year we are going to make sure that the first county board meeting in December, because you can't bind a future board passing it before December, that we will authorize the interfund borrowing for the entire year. So the things that me and Mr. McCarty will do, we won't be able to pay any bills before between November 30th and that first board meeting in December. So hopefully there's nothing critical in that time period. So me and him will work on that. So that's the process going forward. Moving on, the county criminal background check policy. I need a motion to approve, waive the reading and approve. Mr. Vickery, Mr. Scott, if we could get that read into the record, just the title, please.
A resolution of the County Board of Kankakee County, Illinois regarding county's criminal background check policy.
Basically, this is requiring that all employees will have a background check run. County administration, so you know, will be paying for that, because elected offices don't necessarily have to abide by this, if you will. They can, there are some that are statutorily, like schools and the sheriff's department, that they have to run the background checks on. But we'll be running them regardless, because obviously it's our name in the paper if someone's hired that is unfit for the duty that they are going to be hired for. The cost is minimal. That was distributed to the finance committee. So we're going to have a series of internal checks and balances to make sure that that's what's going on. So any other questions about that? All righty, that'll be a roll call vote. Making you work for it.
Mr. Tripp. Aye. Mr. Washington. Aye. Mr. Stauffenberg. Aye. Mr. Vickery. Aye. Mr. Hess. Aye. Mr. Tholen. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Mulcahy. Aye. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes. Aye. Mr. Byrne. Aye. Mr. Seroy. Aye. Mr. Lear. Aye. Mr. Hildebrand. Aye. Mrs. Weber. Aye. Mrs. Peters. Aye. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Aye. Mrs. Parker. Aye. Ms. Dunbar. Aye. Mr. Ritter. Aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Aye. Mr. Fairfield. Aye. Mr. Wheeler.
Aye, motion carries. One thing I forgot to mention, per state law, obviously you can't run a background check just on applicants. That is something that the legislature changed, so we run them pre-offer. The language is, you know, before an offer of employment, we run the background check at that point after the interviews. You can't do it just as part of your screening process, because people with a criminal record, the law says that they have to be seen separately, or just like everybody else, and not separately. So that's the way that you can't even ask about criminal record on the applications anymore. So, so that's just for your own private business. Maybe heads up. So anyway, other business, one opening on the Kankakee County Regional Planning Commission, one opening on the Board of Examiners and Appeals. That's the commercial contractor. One opening on the Manteno Drainage District number 3, one opening on Manteno number 9, one opening on the Wilcan Regional Development Authority. Before we go to old business, I want to remind the criminal justice members that the meeting tomorrow is canceled because everybody is either out of town or there's no business, so why waste the money on a committee meeting? And I'm sure everybody was just really likes getting up at 7:30 in the morning, or being there at 7:30. Well, that's half my day gone already. And also, I want to remind everybody, I need a couple, 2 to 3 volunteers, as to not obviously to violate quorum, but to sit on a hiring committee for the county administrator. So if you want to join in on that, those ads are out. We have applications in, so that's probably going to be at the end of the month. So I need 2 to 3 people to sit in on that. So just let me know after the meeting. I do need to move on that, so that's going to be like sooner than later. I need to know in the next couple of days. So any old business? New business? Mr. Seroy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make the board aware that on March 20th at the Roma Fire Station, it's around 7:30, will be a town hall discussion about the solar garden going off of Highland Road. March 20th at the Roma Park Fire Station, 7:30, for anybody that has questions. I think the questions have to be turned in prior to the meeting, and the lady's name skips my mind right now, but there's a lady, and we can contact the Aroma Township Supervisor, Mr. Lloyd Burling, for any questions on this town hall meeting on the 20th. If anybody has any questions.
Anything else? Mr. Ritter?
Just clarification on that. So if we attend the meeting, are we allowed to talk to anybody there or have people talk to us, or?
Well, you
I mean, I
up-
don't know. I'm confused
And-
because it's coming right down the barrel at me.
I understand. And Mr. Rose is definitely qualified to talk about this, but we had an education on ex parte communication. This isn't like our rules. This is like the law. When they're citing these things, it's way above our pay grade. So when we start talking about this, the communications you can have, you can listen to anybody. As far as it's my understanding, people can talk to you. They can tell you. You just can't have a exchange. You
I'm
can't
more worried about getting
debate.
cornered at the meeting.
Well, it's kind of what you sign up for, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, do I just
You
walk
get
away
cornered.
or just don't say anything? Or
You just need to explain it. You can't engage.
Yeah, you can't engage. Thanks for your input. I can't engage. Yeah, and you know, you can take the email, but you can't respond to it because what it does is, let's just say it's a for instance, and this may be for some people that had public comment. If you're sitting and you have these conversations, okay, and you may have a feeling like you're against it for certain reasons, and they may be valid reasons. If it fails, then they could use your predisposition to challenge that in court and win. So it's a protection actually for both sides to make sure that the process is based on the criteria that's set out by the law. I want to make that clear. It's not something that we do. It can actually work against you if you have a negative feeling like this isn't good for the area or this isn't good for the community, which is actually addressed in one of the criteria, I believe, for the betterment or health and well-being, safety, and of the community, whatever, of the language. Dell's much more versed in that, but it's a protection for both sides. So it may seem odd, and it is kind of odd that you can't even talk to anybody ex parte about this stuff, but you can listen. And I encourage everyone to listen. So, Ms. Evans, sorry.
Was that in existence when the whole railroad thing was going on? Because everyone was certainly.
Well, there was no application in front of the county board at that point.
Okay.
You can gather information, you can have discussions, but we have an application. It's zip.
I just didn't know what process. Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Washington.
We had the same circumstance when we were running deciding on the landfill. We had to remain silent. We couldn't intercommunicate with anything about it.
Correct. Yep. Anyone else? Mrs. Peters?
Can we respond to the email as thank you for your input?
I think that's okay, just to let them know
Okay.
received, thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because if you don't answer, then they're like, well, did you get my email? Or,
I understand. Common courtesies.
Just,
Yeah.
just as long as I don't say anything other than thank you for your input.
Exactly. Yeah. And I encourage that, obviously, it puts us in a weird spot because people think we're elected to be their representative, and in most cases we are. But in that situation, we're almost like judges, and we can only consider the information that's presented to us. We can't, I was encouraged not to go to the ZBA meetings because we're supposed to consider testimony from the ZBA here. We can read the document. So if I'm there, I mean, in past boards, there's been board members who have made comment at those meetings, and we can't, that's really inappropriate. So, we're trying to do things the right way, to walk the line, but it just seems like it's in conflict with an elective democracy that you can't have to put your 2 cents in on it. In that case, it's different. Planning and zoning stuff is way different, so. All right, that's it. Motion, Mr. Mulcahy. Oh, Mr. Hess?
In absence of Mr. LeJust, I would like to make the motion to close.
We have a motion from Bones LeJess and a second from Mr. Mulcahy. All those in favor? Those opposed? Have a good day.
Andy, can you